Thank you, Antoine, and welcome everyone for this panel, and I should call it more a dialogue between academics and policymakers on the role for innovation and competition policy in the digital transformation. As Antoine said, I'm Chiara Criscuolo. I'm the head of the Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship division here at OECD, and I have the honor and the pleasure of chairing a quite unique panel, I would say, of three very distinguished speakers who are with us today. Professor Giovanni Dosi, who is Professor of Economics at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna of Pisa. Fiona Morton, who is the Theodore Nirenberg Professor of Economics at the Yale University School of Management, and Pierre Régibeau, who is the Chief Competition Economist of the European Commission. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the numerous achievements and titles of our speakers today. You can find those in the bio book. But I was rather asked to set the scene for this panel, and I will try to do so very briefly. I always say that images can speak more than words, so I will just provide very brief highlights of the extensive work that we have been conducting at the OECD with colleagues. Let me perhaps share my screen if I manage. Okay, sorry, I was kind of.
It takes a little second, no worry, Chiara.
Okay. 1 second. Apologies for that. What's going on? Okay. We talk about the digital transformation, but I don't manage to share my screen. Okay, should work now, hopefully. I hope you can see my screen. Can you?
Yes, but please, okay, now yes, much better now.
Okay, so let me try to make up for the time lost. So I think we all agreed, and we have heard a lot about this, not only in this, just in the session that we have just listened to, but I think yesterday, Professor Stiglitz gave a great keynote raising a lot of interesting questions, especially for competition policies on the implication of the new business models that the use of data and the use of information have caused in terms of price discrimination and targeted advertising. And what we have seen very clearly in our work in the last few years is that there has been a big divergence in productivity, and even more so when we focus on ICT intensive services, where we really see a big divergence, not only of the top 10%, but even amongst the top 10%, the very few top 2% has really increased, while laggards really struggle to keep pace. This has been accompanied, and perhaps is also partly a reflection of a big increase in markups, especially at the top, and again, much more so in digital intensive sectors, in particular in digital intensive services. Now, when we look at market share, which is something that we cannot look at directly, there is a very recent paper by Tommaso Duso and colleagues that can look at markets. We look at industry, and even within the industry, we see that the share of sales due to the 8 largest group has been increasing. And this is, again, something that we see being, in a way, very strongly correlated with the digital transformation, and more so to the rise of the knowledge sort of intangible economy and the intangible investment increases that we see in our economies. At the same time, we also see a decline in entry rate, again, much more strongly so in digital intensive sectors. So we really see a lot of these trends that have sort of are evident across the economy, but much stronger in sectors that are more digital intensive, that use more intensively and rely much more on investment in intangible assets. We also see, and this is something that probably I will ask Fiona very shortly, a big increase in mergers and acquisition, And again, we see some evidence that this is much more strongly in data processing, software publishing, R&D, and so on. Now, why I want to raise all these issues is that clearly there might be a strong implication not only for productivity and for competition and innovation, but for the value distribution part of the conference today. In fact, we see in recent work with the Linkit project that we are conducting at the OECD in our director jointly with the Economics Department and the Labor and Social Affairs Directorate, that the differences in wages between firms are really playing an ever-increasing role in explaining not only inequality, but also increases in inequality. And this is something that, the paper by Giovanni and co-authors that has just been presented really brought again to the table. So, unsurprisingly, we see that productivity dispersion and wage dispersions are very much correlated, and that this is even stronger when we look at market services. Now, one of the questions that I would also like to bring to the table is the difference across countries. So number one, the increasing concentration that I've showed is much stronger in the US than Europe, and this has led some of the debate to focus at the role of antitrust. But also, there are big differences in the evolution of this platform economy that we talked about, with Europe really lagging far behind the US, but also China in the development of in the predominance, I would say, of these platforms. So these are some of the issues when we talk with policymakers come up often in the debate, and are some of the topics of discussion and questioning across countries. So let me perhaps stop here and let me start with posing some of the questions that perhaps arise, I hope, from the images that I've just shown you. So if I may, let me start with Fiona. Fiona, in your view, given the picture that we just depicted, what can antitrust do? And some of the questions that again are posed to policymakers, whether enforcement should be changed, and if so, in your view, what would be the right approach if we were to change it? Or do you think that we should rely on other tools? I leave you the floor, Fiona.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. I should give a disclosure. I am working at the moment for Amazon on an antitrust matter. So the question you asked is a hard one and a deep one. I do think that there are underlying technological trends going on here that are not related to enforcement that are making this all worse. But I do think we have a bit of a perfect storm, because in addition to those trends, we have, at least in the United States, a 50-year trend of doing less enforcement in the antitrust space ever since the mid-70s. I believe that the evidence is now mounting up in the United States, or has mounted, to show us that was wrong. It doesn't. Markets will not self-correct. We will get all of the problems that you just very nicely explained. So this is a wrong direction. We have to turn around. I think this is now evident to everybody, and the question is, how do we turn around? We have a judiciary in the United States that is quite hostile to antitrust enforcement. So really, to be effective in enforcement, we have to have a new law. And the new law has to explain to the courts, here's what's been going wrong, here's what's concerning Congress. The people want competitive markets. The people benefit from competitive markets, both in innovation and in quality and in price. And we need courts to protect people from market power, the creation of market power and the exercise of market power. So that's a big thing we have to do in the US. We also have to sink a lot more money into enforcement. The economy has been growing, and we have not been growing our enforcement efforts. And so then you can, of course, do just less and less every year. And when the economy gets bigger, you want to protect all sectors. It's not like we care about competition in drugs, but not in digital platforms, or digital platforms, but not in transportation. So we care about competition everywhere. And Senator Klobuchar was quite eloquent on that subject yesterday in a panel at Public Knowledge, which I encourage everybody to go watch if you want a sort of a crisp update on the U.S. Political situation in antitrust enforcement. So that's antitrust. But I think even if you did everything exactly right, you funded the agencies, told them to go out and do things, changed the law, you still have a major gap. And where does that gap come from? It comes from market power that did not derive from an antitrust violation. Remember, antitrust says you have to do the following bad things in order to be found liable. Well, we have big network effects, big economies of scale. Firms can create entry barriers without violating the antitrust laws or doing things that would be extremely difficult to prove under the antitrust laws. As a society, what do we want to do about that market power? Well, in democracies, we don't have to accept it. We could say the distribution of rents appears to be all going to the big firm and none to the consumers or none to the complements on the platform. And we don't like that, so we're going to pass a law that changes the way those rents are redistributed. And that would be an example of that would be the Digital Markets Act, where explicitly the idea, one of the goals is fairness. We are going to just change the way these rents are distributed. And another example of that would be the Digital Markets Unit in the UK, where explicitly one of the goals is to limit the exercise of market power that has already occurred. And whether it already occurred through lax antitrust enforcement or through just luck or accident, we're silent on that. We're just going to try to limit its exercise. So regulation is the new tool. The Europeans are stepping ahead with that. It's very exciting. I think probably there'll be some improvements and modifications to the draft that we've all seen. The United States only managed to sue everybody 3 months ago. So we're 10 years behind, just getting accustomed to the idea that we have antitrust laws again and we're using them. But I think once the COVID crisis recedes and people are able to see the whole landscape again, what they're going to realize is the hearing in Facebook and Google cases is in 2023. Then there'll be a trial, then there'll be an appeal, then there'll be another decision, and it'll be probably 26, 27. I don't know when we'll actually see a change in markets. That's longer probably than most people would like to wait. So I think we'll see something change in the United States, but I don't know what it will be.
Thank you, Fiona. And unless Pierre wants already to sort of respond from the EU side, I'll leave the floor to Giovanni and then I'll get back to you because Fiona raised the issue of regulation that I would like to get back to. So Giovanni, I mean, you're probably one of those who were responsible of the title of this conference, which is Value Creation and Distribution in the Digital Era. And one of the consequences of increased concentration and market power is not only, as we said, on the creation of the value, but also on this distribution, which is something that Fiona already raised. Now, in recent analysis that you led, you discussed how what you define as intelligent automation is likely to exacerbate existing inequalities. So could you perhaps tell us more about this work and what do you think are the important implications for policy making in light of your study?
Well, already yesterday, just Stiglitz was hinting at that. I mean, by intelligent automation, I mean the convergence between automation and digitalization and artificial intelligence. So you have increasingly machine that can adopt conditional behavior and can learn to some extent. Now, something that it will take time, but in some areas, the digitalization, intelligent automation has already made inroads, especially platforms. And platforms have an enormous effect on the distribution of power and the distribution of income between the owner of the platform and the people using the platform. Think of Uber, because there, and Fiona already said it. I mean, the information-intensive activities are characterized by strong increasing return. We know it from, at least from Canaro. And there is a fundamental incompatibility between increasing returns and any kind of general equilibrium. I don't think that this can be handled with antitrust, because as you know, saying there are technological reasons associated with information itself. This is a case, in my view, that requires strict regulation. I mean, even a laissez-faire free market book would say, in these cases, either you regulate or you nationalize. Even laissez-faire books would say that. Well, I would not be against nationalization, except that since information is a very delicate item, to go the Chinese way is not does not thrill to centralize our information in the government. But I think that something has to be done, and I don't think that antitrust works, or it works only to some extent. For unbundling, for separating activities. But there is a more profound problem. The other, in addition to regulation, I think we need to rediscover taxation. And taxation has got to be on the turnover, because it's very difficult to say what is the value added. The value added is basically ourselves that give the information to Google, and we give it for free. And Google capitalizes on it and packages and sells the information on me and you. So I think the only way to curb the intrinsic tendency to unequal distribution of income is heavy taxation of the information-intensive company. This is, to my knowledge, is the only way. And the extension by law of the right of common employees, standard employees, the extension also to the platform workers, to give them the same guarantees that non-information workers have. And I think this can only be done by law, because these workers are very weak. They don't get the strength coming from working together in a factory, in the contract. And so can only come from politics, their strength. That's it.
No, thank you, Giovanni. And I mean, I should say that we haven't paid you to say these things, but the OECD is very much, I think, aligned, especially, is doing very important work on, the question of taxation and coordination across countries, because this is really something both, I would say, in terms of taxation and labor laws, where I think coordination is particularly important across countries, and I think the OECD is doing great work in this area. I think both you, Giovanni, and Fiona mentioned regulation as one of the important, I would say, complements to antitrust. And I think Pierre is probably, given his experience as chief competition economist, but also as practitioner, to tell us a bit more in which way, regulation can help, and, how should be the, regulation be designed to achieve this.
Okay, thank you. Before telling you how I think regulation can help, I have to go a little bit through what I think the problems that regulatory, normal antitrust tools and merger controls might face in the new world. And clearly, we are concerned about this documented increase in market power and concentration. From that point of view, I will actually point out that if you think about the world of great platforms, right, where of course they are integrated, but they also have the whole ecosystems which are really tied very closely to each other. This ecosystem ties would not be captured by the data that tell us an increase in concentration. Then of course, competition between systems itself can be fierce, but still there's a significant aspect in the increasing quote-unquote concentration of those market structures that is not even reflected in those data. Now, why do we think that competition and competition policy can still help in the digital world? Well, for the same basic reason as anywhere else, we think that we want a level playing field so that competition of the merit can arise, entrants with something that the incumbent doesn't have actually can get their chance. So that's an equal opportunity version for competition policy. Now, why do we care about that? Because we think that if you have that, you're going to have lower prices, better quality. We tend to believe also, although there might be exceptions, that you're going to have greater innovation. But in the digital world, there are kind of other concerns that are kind of attached a little bit to that. And these are the concerns of privacy and the general concern of increased power in society of those undertaking. I'll come back to this in a moment. So let's first kind of look at mergers. In mergers, we do something very simple. We compare the kind of potential pressure upward on price, downward on quality, downward on innovation that might result if there's significant overlap in those activities across the parties at large. And we know that any overlap creates such a pressure. If it's significant, then we're going to say, look, unless you divest or unless you show us some compensatory efficiencies, then we're going to give you trouble, right? And that's where the privacy and the market power things come in. We do not treat privacy as something which is not a concern at all for competition policy, because after all, privacy is also an aspect of quality for the consumers. So we always look at quality, so why not at privacy? But that's not the only aspect. So for example, if this is going to be a merger, take the Google Fitbit merger, for example. Fitbit users might be concerned about the loss of privacy. We don't dismiss this. On the other hand, of course, whether there's a concern or not goes to, do Fitbit users have an alternative to go to somewhere else if they're unhappy about that? This is a totally standard kind of analysis. But there are some aspects that we cannot capture with the traditional efficiencies. That is the fact that by using your data, even if you decide to stay there and have less privacy, I might be able to learn to guess more about consumers that are not even clients of mine. And we get into the very fashionable issue of out-of-market externalities that in principle we're not allowed to take into account, but of course that raised its head also in the context of the Green Deal, right? So that's one of the issues that we face. And clearly, when you talk about the power impact and the power limiting aspect of antitrust, because remember there, at the birth of antitrust, that's something that kind of has receded in the background, and from which we clearly no longer have power, but that's clearly something that ought to be dealt with at the societal level. So that's the first 2 points for merger. There are 2 other points for merger. That when you think of it, the kind of merger we worry about in the digital world is really not most of the time this kind of horizontal overlap merger. It's always been the case that in some mergers what we worry about is that it changes your incentive to do something nasty after that. And generally speaking, you can say it's a nasty under the name of kind of foreclosure. And precisely because of this kind of ecosystem competition, these tend to be more and more and more our dominant concern when we look at those platform mergers. Not horizontal overlap, but the potential for competition, for foreclosure. Again, Google Fitbit. The concern was, would Android remain available as well for kind of other time of digital way? So that's the kind of thing we were worried more and more. Okay? And then, of course, there's the other issue, which is the issue of early innovation. And innovation is tied to digital in several ways. First, it's a very dynamic sector. So there are lots of startups. Startups are under our radar, right? So we cannot catch. Also, things go very quickly. And you become a very big player, even if you haven't made much money. So again, we don't catch you. On top of it, because everything happens clearly and the insiders know about what's good or not, they can acquire this company to the point where we, regulator, are very ill-informed as to whether their substitutes complement the short-term and long-term. So that's again a digital specific aspect that we face. Okay. I'm also very concerned about an aspect of competition law that we usually don't think about. In order to have competition, consumers need good information. They need good information on price. They need good information as to what is offered to them. And that's where I start my discussion of regulation. That's the first point where I think regulation can be very important. For example, if you have a buy box, and I'm a consumer, I'd like to use a buy box, but I'd like to know a little bit what's in the buy box. How do you choose it, right? Otherwise, how can I make an informed choice? If I'm a consumer and I buy, an app in store, I might want to also know that those kind of apps might be available somewhere, maybe at a lower price. So things go out of their way to kind of decrease this kind of information unless they have a deficiency reason, are things that I don't think are good. And that are things that can be dealt with very easily by regulation and do not necessarily need kind of full-scale databases. The second point where regulation will intervene is, as I already said, for those kind of societal aspects of privacy and market power. We also have to deal with the way you deal with competitors. That's my, foreclosure stuff. And there are two levels. There's the easy level. You cannot needlessly make competitors' life hard, especially if you're in a position to do this because of this competitor's dependency on you. So, for example, if you have a platform where other trades and you're in competition, and I'm not going to get into the detail of what's good or bad there, but you should not kind of impose conditions, kind of do things that don't have good excuses, economic intent, except to make life hard for those competitors. For example, contractuality should be clear, appeals procedures should be clear, and all of that. And then finally, when you get to really foreclosures, that's a bit difficult because I think that their antitrust authorities have a good expertise. But if you look at the DMA, there is one thing which is done, that they don't say that bundling or tying is bad per se, but they say if tying is between what they call two core platforms. So for example, you tie Android with Google search. These are two dominant platforms. That a priori, we're going to consider that this is bad. And while I'm not a fan of regulation getting deeper than that into bundling and tying, I think this is an appropriate intervention. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Pierre. I mean, I think at the end of this first round of questions, there is a lot of room for policy, both I think on, I would say, extending some of the aspects that antitrust looks at, and I think the issue of privacy is a very important one, but also the complementary role of regulation, and also I would say the holistic approach of including, taxation and labor market in the picture to really achieve, as I think I don't remember who of you used, but a fairer division of these gains. So unless there are questions from the audience already, perhaps we can push them at the end, and perhaps let me ask you a second round of question that again comes from the evidence that we presented, but also some of the issues that came up from your answers, and in particular, as I said, one of the questions that come up when we talk with European policymakers and they're comparing the situation in Europe versus the US, there seems to be a real concern about the fact that there is a lack of platforms, as I showed you, relative to the US, but also relative to China. Now, from what we have been discussing, perhaps this is not a big issue, but I want to ask you, and I mean, let me start with Fiona. Do you think this lack of platforms should be a worry? And, do you think this will be a problem for Europe's future in terms of innovation and growth?
Well, I think the current platforms need supervision. I think they've had basically none up till now. So certainly growth in all jurisdictions, given that we have this set of platforms, is going to depend on how they are regulated and how antitrust enforcement goes. So that's what we've got. Then looking forward, it seems to me like Europe might want to introspect a little bit about how to make the conditions for entry and growth and entrepreneurship as positive as possible. I mean, I will say, however, why do we get these things in the United States? I think partially it's because we have just what I might describe as a worse economy to begin with. Like if everybody's in a suburb far away from each other and needing to drive somewhere, obviously e-commerce is more attractive than if you have lovely cafes and shops right downstairs from your apartment. Why would you want Uber in a city where the taxi service is beautifully maintained BMWs with polite drivers who come on time? In the United States, taxis are low quality and unreliable. So if you've already got good solutions, then you're not as quick to adopt new ones, I think. So part of this is solving problems that the United States has that Europe doesn't have. Maybe I'll put it that way. Having said that, this process is going to unroll going forward for decades to come. And I think it is sensible for every economy to think about what are the conditions for a startup? What are the incentives? What are the payoffs? What kinds of regulations support innovation? Now, once you've got a platform, for example, a lot of innovation, I think, is building on top of it and thinking about new ways to deliver business services through it. And if you have too much market power in the platform and it sucks out all the rents, then you're not going to get the innovation that builds on top of the platform. So these are the kinds of issues I think that are definitely worth considering, but worth considering in Europe and the rest of the world, actually.
No, thank you, Fiona. This again gets to the question on incentives for innovation and the role of policy there. I think and this is perhaps a question for Pierre. One of the things we haven't mentioned and one of the policies that we haven't mentioned up to now is really industrial policy. And we know that government can, influence the rate of innovation and the quality and the direction of innovation also via industrial policy and active industrial policy. Now, one of the questions, and I think especially after some recent cases brought at in front of the European Commission, there is a question on how much should industrial policy be interventionist and what are the risks for competition policy, and therefore what are the implications for innovation if governments are too interventionist and too active in their industrial policy intervention. So what is your view? What are the risks that you see and the opportunities at the same time for industrial policy in this digital world here?
Okay, I'll cheat and encroach a little bit on Fiona's question to also, but that's also an introduction in industrial policy, because say, oh, it's too bad we don't have platforms. And if you think that the follow-up is that therefore we should have an industrial policy platform, you first should stop and say, oh, what are we missing out by not having platforms? And when I look at this, I say we're certainly not missing on getting all of the services from those platforms. Actually, given their platform model, they tend to be free. And in terms of the other side of advertising, we pay, as a European user or US users, you pay the high rate. In terms of investors, anybody is free to buy shares in Google or startups, whether you're European or not. So in the sense, in what sense are those firms American? And so that leaves us with employment. And first, we know that those firms do not create that much employment directly, and that some of this is spread over the world anyway. So, why do you want to fight for that is I think, a legitimate question to start with. So what I would propose is that why people are upset about the Europe not having a platform is not because of the payoff, but because it is a symptom of Europe's own shortcoming in the general area of innovation. It's a symptom of less coercive taking, it's a symptom of a different bankruptcy law, it's a symptom of conservative banks, of not well enough developed venture capital, and so on and so on. So I think really is the idea. Of course, as an economist believing in first best, second best, and third best, I would say if that's the symptom, well, we need to treat the causes of the symptom. And that leads us directly into industrial policy, because some causes of the symptoms are in the background. That's education, that's banking, This is not industrial policy, because if you're going to define industrial policy, there's got to be measures that are at least specific to a sector, maybe even to a firm. So that's not industrial policy. And I'm really afraid that if we get too enamored with industrial policy, we kind of, get the forest for the tree, concentrate on that, and forget that our problem really comes from the background. Okay? Now,
Pierre, I think Fiona wants to say something. Sorry.
I 100% agree with you, Pierre, and I wanted to pile on one more thing, which is wages and labor protections. Some of the innovation in platforms in the United States has come by just not paying labor properly or violating labor standards, and then that has consequences for democracy and for income inequality and so on. And so maybe some of these business models that have been invented in the United States are not ones that one wants to bring to Europe, or at least not without modification, because they cause other follow-on problems.
And of course, I come back to Giovanni's intervention about workers' right with respect to platform. And in this respect, I would mention that the DG Com is at least looking at how competition policy might at least get out of the way of platform worker being able to organize something like that. So that's not something we are not looking at. So let's move to industrial policy. I'm not against industrial policy, although as an old international trade hand, I'm very skeptical of the success of all those generation of import substitution, strategic trade, with very little evidence. First, that they work at all in making the sector more successful, and I've almost never seen any evidence that they were a good investment, even if they go in the right direction, giving you the rate of return you would want. So I'm very skeptical. Still, let's look at the favorite of many of the politicians, the European champion, right? So big is beautiful. Why? Why? Because they can be more efficient than before. Otherwise, what's the point of putting them together, right? Well, we do look at that. We do look at that. We do look at mergers. We do look at potential entry. We look at mergers. So if you really think that big is beautiful, you need national champions, I really do not see how, unless we are leftist bureaucrat bent on destroying national champion and therefore are tougher on those than we are tougher on other ones, and that's not true, I don't see why we say the way. If something makes sense, well, there's something we'll go through. We certainly do not stop way too many mergers. Let's just face it, right? If we probably are on the other way. There are also kind of some strange things in those advocacy of European champion. So they tend not to be European champion, but to say, for example, European, French and Germany champions that will fight on behalf of Europe. But the problem is that in this computation, very legitimately, the French and German government are going to weigh the benefits to their farm against maybe the cost to their consumers, but not to consumers in the rest of Europe. And I think a number of smaller countries have latched onto this, which is now there's a number of those who actually are opposing the faction, the Poland, Germany, French faction with a big gung-ho on this form of industrial policy. So am I a fan of European champions per se as a panacea, or even as something which is likely to work often? The straight answer is no. And on top of it, I don't see that we stand in the way of good European champions. There are other ways to do things. And I will finish up detectable trends. That's something I've discussed in other fora. And this called IPCI tool, the Important Project of Common European Interest. And that seems to be, to me, a good way of doing industrial policy. You identify something. We just published the batteries one, where there seems to be that we're lagging behind in terms of innovation. And then those things are supposed to help finance innovation, in this case, investment, that on their own would not be profitable at this time. We go through detailed analysis to see what the gap is, and then you can subsidize up to the gap. On top of it, this is not a big project. There are 20, 30, 40, 50 firms from different countries involved. So it's a network, and it's a network of small projects, and we insist that this is not just a way to get money, that there's some consistency and some spillovers, some coherence between these projects. So it seems to me like if we had taken one of the Paul Krugman's old book on economic geography and tried to implement it as a trade instrument. We've got this beautiful instrument. It's not a panacea, but let's use it, and let's not always talk about national champion or European champions.
Indeed, let me follow up with one question on this, Pierre, because I mean, you raise the point of, it's not a lot of money. And actually one of the questions that I've heard when talking to policymakers, like perhaps there should be more money. They should be more ambitious. They're not ambitious enough. What would you answer to that?
Well, in the latest battery case, we have firms like Tesla, BMW is one involved. So believe me, if those firms thought that they need more money in order to do the R&D, they would not be shy in asking. And of course, we always try to keep them down a little bit and be reasonable. So again, I've got 3 or 4 people at the CT who kind of full-time kind of look at those business plans. People who are trained, financial accountant, economists, and so on, and try to determine really first, whether it's a gap is worth doing, and then what this gap could be. Now, given that the tool exists, and then we're going to help you finance a gap, then of course it's up to you to come up with projects.
Thank you, Pierre. Let me now conclude with Giovanni, because I would still like to leave a bit of time for questions and debate from the audience. I think, Giovanni, you are probably a bit more interventionist than Pierre. You discussed this when you mentioned nationalization as one potential solution to the problem. So, what can, we talked about industrial policy, perhaps let's focus on innovation policy. And what kind of measures of innovation policies you think could governments use to sort of change the situation, or at least improve it? When we look at declining entry rates, increased concentration and so on. So what do you think, what can we do to change this and to improve it? Giovanni, you are muted. Let me unmute you. I cannot unmute you. You have to mute yourself.
You have to take care of yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Well, I would start from the paradox of industrial policy. I mean, the country of the West that talks the least about industrial policy is the one that does more industrial policy, the United States. They're not called as such, but if you take the book of Mariana Mazzucato on the public content of innovation, from the internet, that was Milnet, all the way to the web that was coming from CERN in Europe, to the very component of a smartphone. I mean, part of the ingredients, innovative ingredients of contemporary innovation come from direct state intervention. Well, this is not called industrial policy. Let's use another word. But this is, the state has been instrumental in shaping the rate and direction of innovation. And has been most effective when it used procurement and what Mariana called mission. We are trapped in Europe into the market-friendly philosophy. And so it has got to be horizontal, it has got to be plain field. We have got to be extremely discretionary. I mean, we need to have, for example, a big intervention in the domain of health and drugs and vaccines. We cannot pay the private industry to do research or do research ourselves, then transfer basically for free the outcome of the research to big pharma, then they will sell it back to us with an enormous markups. This is totally unfeasible and is going to destroy the health system where the public health system where there is one, like in Europe, or prevent the construction of a public health system where there is not one, like in the United States. I think that don't call them industrial policy, call them public intervention in setting the rate and direction of innovation. Sometimes you need direct intervention on the structure of it. I mean, if you did not have the public, we would not have Airbus in Europe. I think this is, I don't know how much Pierre was involved, but preventing the merger between Alstom and Siemens, it seems to me that was unreasonable from the point of view both of international competition and long-term rate of innovation. Then you say, well, what about the small firms? I mean, my mentor, Keith Pavitt, used to say, well before the information revolution, talking about microelectronics, used to say, why in America you have got a lot of newborn firms? Because of the failure of the incumbent. Is a sign of the failure of the incumbent to efficiently innovate. In fact, I mean, if an incumbent has got the max time span for planning innovation, that is the tenureship of the CEO, then you are not going to have very long-term far-sighted innovative activities. And then you'll have young firms that enter, they don't have anything to lose, and they know that if they will succeed, they will be bought up for a few $1 billion by the incumbent. This is socially totally unfunctional. There is this, so I would not worry about the fact that there is a fall in the rate of entry. I'm worried much more by the fact that there is an increasing short-termism by the incumbent. And this is due to the financialization of companies. And again, this interacts with the income distribution issue that we were discussing before. In the States, in the 50s, there was a discussion between, say, left and right, whether it was fair to have a CEO paid 40 times a worker. Now we are talking about 4,000 times, and nobody says anything about it. And if someone comes and tells me that this is because the marginal productivity of CEOs has increased so much. I mean, you've got to call the ambulance. It does not even deserve a discussion. I mean, if you have missions, then and the public setting to repeat the rate and direction of innovation to a good extent, especially in the direction that we care about, health, the environment, green trajectories, then small new firms will come almost like mushrooms. If you provide the procurement, you provide a sort of direction to the trajectories of search. And this can only be done by the public.
Giovanni, are you advocating for a European DARPA, perhaps?
Oh, yes, I love that.
Would that be a good summary of where we are trying to? Let me perhaps, because I'm conscious of time, and I saw that Pierre was kind of mumbling in the background because he was muted, but I'm sure when you mentioned the Siemens Alstom case, I could see some reaction, and having read the report on the Siemens Alstom case, I'm quite a few thoughts on that.
No, but first, I do agree with Giovanni. As I said, this is all background in the economy that creates a condition for innovation, and this is very important. Why I depart partially from him is going from condition. The US gave some directions to procurement and so on, and this was successful. We don't know the counterfactual. We don't know what other direction, maybe socially more worthwhile, would have developed without, for example, the US investing in military technology. And if I really believe in the political system as reflecting the needs of citizens, maybe my view will be less jaundiced, especially if I didn't, again, as former trade hand, know how strong lobby can be, and up to the point that even if lobby in equilibrium is not effective, the resources wasted on this process are proportional to the price. So if you start designing kind of mission with high prices, well, the lobby cost is going to be much harder. So I still don't think that there's very convincing evidence about the effectiveness of mission. And I think one of the proof of that is that the one example everybody mentions is Airbus. I'm waiting for the other 2,000 examples that should come as a result of those kind of very well-designed policy. Now, in terms of intervention, I'm not against intervention. When you mention health, I actually agree that failure. This time, public economics health. I remember this literature that we had about mixed oligopoly, where you could have, public-owned firms that, through their participation in the market, can help regulate the market. Why don't we have public-owned firms doing some research, doing generics, for example, to make sure that they're not discouraged by deal and stuff like this, to kind of discipline the private firm on aspects that we find it hard to discipline otherwise. So I'm completely open to this kind of stuff. As for us and Siemens, I'm sorry, but the one question I'm going to have to ask you, and all of the commentators who always kind of sit and say, you got it wrong, have you looked at what the documented efficiencies of the deal was? Have you looked at what the actual evidence about potential Chinese entry was? I'm sorry, before decision is taken, it's very nice to alert the Commission on those aspects so that we look at it. But when we've looked at it on the evidence, unless you've had a look at the evidence yourself, I think one should be a little bit less categorical.
Okay, I will leave it at that for now because I had another question for all of you. I think is enough debate, and perhaps I don't know whether I should leave the floor to Nancy Gallini or to Jane Bilow. I don't know. Bill Janaway and Nancy Gallini seem to have merged in the same person.
No, not Nancy. She's going to talk forever.
But in order to give Nancy the word, I have to be able to identify her. But the only thing that I find is Nancy Gallini, and then I get Bill. So Nancy, which name are you linking with?
I don't know. While we solve the question, let me perhaps pose a question that we have in the Q&A while we manage to... Bill, it wasn't you posing the question, was
Yes, it was.
It was you posing the question.
It was exactly me posing the question, which induced... I have never played a transgender role in a conference on digital technologies before, so I'm deeply honored and clearly will tweet this out to a universe beyond. My comment was really in response to Pierre with respect to his understandable concern about seeking to promote national or regional champions as the vehicles for reaching the innovation frontier. And I was summoning up with respect specifically to the battery technology need, where we both have need for the kind of work that a Tesla can do, extending existing technology, while simultaneously having need for upstream exploration of entirely alternative science-based technologies, which are beginning to take place very broadly across research universities. And what I was pointing out was this very much resembles the challenge that faced the United States Department of Defense circa 1950 to 1960, when in parallel, it funded advanced research in semiconductor physics at AT&T Bell Labs, IBM Yorktown Heights, and across a range of the new emerging research universities. But it also, and this is the point, deployed its procurement power to buy the output of this new R&D that was nowhere near cheap or reliable enough for commercial applications. And it chose to buy preferentially from the new innovative entrants to the industry, companies like Texas Instruments and Intel by 1960, and pulled them down the learning curve to low-cost, reliable production. So this was a role for the state implementing an industrial policy without honoring, protecting, generating rents for the established incumbents. By the way, it's exactly the opposite in the computer sector of what Britain, France, and Germany did in the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when ICL and Machine Bull were guaranteed the public sector market, which meant that they never learned how to compete in commercial markets and were wiped out by IBM. Long comment, but I think it's very relevant to this discussion.
Okay, I'd be very short in response. I agree with that. It looks like an IPCI before IPCI. And in terms of procurement, my first reaction was in other industry where you subsidize by procurement or otherwise might not be the more efficient. But in this case, as you point out, these industries were learning by doing was very important. So exactly. Procurement was the right tool because it directly addressed the externality, the market failure. Yes.
By the way, we've just had a magnificent example of the power of procurement in the acceleration of vaccine development in response to pre-production commercial contracts from state entities. And at least in the case of Pfizer and Moderna, it seems to have been very worthwhile.
Also, I would say this is a very special case where we knew quite precisely what we wanted.
We knew what we wanted, but we didn't know that the RNA technology would work. That's my point.
Yeah, which is precisely why this kind of policies have to be as open and as unprescriptive as possible. Yeah.
Correct. Agreed.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Bill, for the question, and thank you, Pierre, for the answer. If no one else wants to add, let me perhaps ask Ruben Maximiano, who's a colleague from the competition division. He has two questions on the chat. I don't know, Ruben, if you want to come in and ask the question yourself, you're welcome to do so.
Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome, Ruben.
Hi, Chiara. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel indeed. I had a question here for both Pierre and Fiona, I guess, mainly, which is about the tools for to allow competition authorities to analyze accurately innovation. So, one of the questions that was just raised was, this came in the context of the Siemens-Alstom case, where you mentioned, Pierre, the innovation story, and that there was no good story. But I wonder to what extent, and I'm not talking now specifically about Siemens-Alstom, but more broadly, what tools do we have to measure effects on innovation? I mean, we have well-developed tools for price effects. I mean, competition authorities have been adept and competition economists at developing these tools over the last 30 years. It's become very price-centric. We're now in a world where innovation is key, as all dissemination of innovation runs through the economy. How good are competition authorities at measuring that innovation? And what tools do they have, and what needs to be done in order to move from a price-centric to an innovation-centric competition policy?
I feel pretty strongly about this. I think that at least in the United States, we have a problem where judges think that empirical precision represents the importance of a question to consumers, and this is just not true. Academic economists work on problems they want to work on. Scanner data gets invented, and they decide to work on that. And if most consumer welfare is coming out of gains from innovation rather than allocative efficiency caused by changes in prices, then innovation is really important. And yet the tools that we have in economics for quantifying and measuring, as you ask, are nowhere near as good as the ones we have in prices. Does that mean that we should put less weight on innovation? Absolutely not. That's just an artifact of the way the tools have developed. So I think what we know today is that we have been under-enforcing and that we have been underweighting concerns about innovation and competition that leads to innovation. So while it is the case that we can't precisely quantify things, we know the direction of movement that we should be going in. And so I think that gives us low-hanging fruit for first steps. If you convince me that we have overcorrected at some point, I'm happy to go back, but I think let's move in the direction we know that we need to move in first, because governments and policy take forever to change. And meanwhile, work on tools. But I will have a hard time imagining that economics is ever going to be able to say, in a counterfactual world, here are 6 that would have been invented. Okay, that's a really high bar. So we're going to have to think of some ways to proxy for this, or some ways to measure incentives that don't require the tool to say, here are the creative ideas that would have occurred in this counterfactual world. But it's super, super important for policymakers to not to confuse precision with importance.
Thank you. Pierre, go ahead.
I really agree with that. As you know, DG Commerce tried to develop some tools and to look more and more in the innovation aspect. There's some resistance. People like to do the things they've done before. In terms of tool, yes and no. No, in the sense that at the basic level of what would be the possible downward pressure on innovation from a merger with overlap, essentially, we need kind of the same numbers as we need for the price pressure index. You need the diversion ratio as the same. So the only thing that we need to have a precise quantification is the link between investment and shift in market share. So there, yes, we have less of that, but at least the concept is the same. So at this level, what I try to do is say, well, a priori, we have reason to believe that if you don't have efficiencies, just like always, your merger is not going to be good for innovation. Now, on the efficiencies, and I've written on this, I do believe that there are more potential sources of efficiencies in innovation than the traditional production efficiencies. And there are possible ways of documenting that. I have given some hints as to how that could be done. I think that we can do now. I haven't seen a party who has taken us up on this so far and come up with, doing some minimal thing about area of research, pattern, and this kind of stuff. We haven't seen that. Now, going beyond that, in terms of being more precise, also more precise about what kind of things would be, that's the ground. But we're very, very far away from that. Now, whether the fact that we're not precise bias things against or for innovation, I must say that I would need some convincing to say that there's evidence that our current practice biases things against innovation.
thank you, Pierre. And you know, I guess it's again a warning about not looking under the light post. You know, so it's exactly this point, I think. We are a bit 2 minutes over time. I'm quite conscious of that. I don't know if any of you wants to add something. I think we have learned so much that I would be not making justice to this discussion if I were to summarize it. So I'm glad we have a recording because there are so many issues that have discussed. So thank you, and thank you for the great questions and the participants and the great debate. Let me give the floor back to, we have, I think, a comfort break, if I'm not wrong. So let me now give the floor to anyone except a big thank you again to Fiona, Pierre, and Giovanni. I was prepared to something good. This was amazing. So thank you again. That was great.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao.
Bye.